This is an Empty Closet Radio podcast. Get more at facebook.com/emptyclosetradio. So camp.
Stop laughing at me. It's not even funny.
Yes, it is.
Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Sam.
And this is The Empty Closet.
The show for everyone, whether you're in the closet
Or out and proud. Or
somewhere in between.
We haven't talked a lot about safe spaces. Yes, we have. We always talk about safe spaces. So when we talk about safe spaces, in my mind, it conjures up like physical spaces, like physical buildings, like parks, venues, places that you go. Are they safe? Are they not? I'm kind of pretty clued in to how to figure out whether a space is okay or not. But when you start thinking about, like, what's a safe space online and what does that look like, things get a little bit more harder for me to figure out.
Yeah, see, for me, I guess it depends a little bit what you're defining as a safe space. So for me, a safe space is literally a place where you are comfortable in being who you are. So there's like layers of safe space. So ideally, like for me, for instance, my absolute safe space is my own, like, room. You know, my little tiny house that is my domain, and that, you know, people don't come in unless I invite them, and that's where I can most be myself. But there are other environments where, you know, I'm surrounded by like-minded people, or I'm around people who know aspects of myself and are very comfortable with that, or really happy to know that, or whatever. So, you know, gay clubs are a classic one, particularly for gay men. But then, you know, the proud women's dance that sometimes gets run during Pride is a really big one for queer women, you know, and then there's anything where people can feel they have something in common and be themselves is a safe space. And this does extend to online spaces. So I guess, like, in some ways, GPS-based hookup apps are kind of safe spaces, but also kind of not. I guess it depends on the kind of person you are.
Yeah, they're just a minefield, I think. Like, when I think about a safe space, like, and if I think about your GPS-based hookup apps, like, there's part of me that's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a really convenient thing to do. And there's part of me that's like, PTSD alert, like, this is going to be triggering and it's going to be, like, terrible. Like, you do not need to log online and, like, have all of these people who you really don't care about making you feel bad about who you are. So I'm like, oh, that's not a safe thing, like, for me. And so for me, it wasn't, like, great. And I know that I'm perhaps not the only person who feels like that. And there's a few people that I know of that have deleted some of the online dating platforms simply because they didn't feel good on them. And I think, like, feeling good can equate to part of that safety thing as well.
Yeah, but then I guess there's a difference between an online space that's primary motive is hooking up versus online spaces that are for communities. So, for instance, a lot of kinksters, a lot of members of the BDSM community get in contact with other people who are like them and or, you know, safe places to talk about what they're interested in, what they're not interested in online communities. And those communities are not primarily for hooking up. They're for finding people who are similar to you to talk to. Whether or not that leads to hooking up is totally irrelevant. And I think that's kind of a bit of a difference. There's no expectation in a safe space, whereas there is an expectation with dating apps.
Yeah, they're full of expectations. Absolutely. And in some of those online communities, I mean, we've seen just, in the last, or fairly recently, the last month or so, one of the largest hosting platforms for these online communities that, I mean, some people will say they're safe, some people will say they're not. But Tumblr is the one I'm talking about. It has been basically completely restructured because one company decided not to stock their app in the App Store. And so the whole community structure has all been changed, and lots of people who were really engaging with that community, and perhaps in a way that is not traditionally the way that people see communities. So, like, it's not completely, G-rated sometimes. But it's a unique part of who we are. So those communities have been either like silenced or shut down or moved on. What do you make of that?
I think it's important to remember that a safe space for one group is not meant to be a safe space for everybody. So I'll come back to the example of Kinksters because I'm not particularly practicing, but I'm interested in kink, in various aspects of kink. And so there are spaces online that I go to engage with that content, to talk to people, to learn things, because you need to educate yourself. That is not a place that I would direct my 12-year-old nephew, you know, or my 15-year-old cousin necessarily. But it's still a safe space for me and for what I need at that point. You know, it's a non-judgmental space. I don't think that spaces where, you know, where people within the queer community go to talk about the horrible experiences they've had in coming out to their families and gain support from other people, that's not necessarily somewhere that a really, really conservative Christian is going to feel safe. They're going to feel attacked, but it's actually not a space for them. So I think this is the problem with how Tumblr have dealt with this particular issue, is they've not considered that their audience is multifaceted, and they've just gone, oh, well, we'll do this and everyone will be fine with, you know, the decision that we hand down, and not realizing that it would immediately lead to the destruction of so much content. And as a consequence, so many other people would leave as well.
Yeah, and I feel like the vast majority of what was on there is kind of like, it bridges that gap between like maybe like adult content and community space. Like, people actually talk about the content, and quite often it's quite intelligent conversation in the comments, if you ever read the comments. But sometimes it's quite intelligent conversation. So all of that will just be lost, and we need to find another space or another forum for that. You're listening to the Empty Closet podcast. Why not connect with us on our Facebook page? Just search for Empty Closet Radio and hit the like button. There's a few safe spaces that have been changing. One of them, which we've already talked about, is Tumblr. One that stands out to me is actually Snapchat. So that's, for people who have never used the app, basically it's like when it came out, it was like you can take a photo, you can send it to someone, and like someone being like one of your friends who also has the app, and you can tell it when it will self-destruct. So it's a bit like sending a little photo that will self-destruct, and you can say you can see it for like 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever. And the person couldn't screenshot it, so they could never like keep the image. And I feel that this has changed over time, because I feel like now people can do screenshots.
There's not any feeling about it. Like, it has changed. So no longer, everything can now be screenshotted or screen grabbed. Even videos, if you have the right other software on your device. And Snapchat tells you within the app if somebody's viewed your picture again or taken a screenshot, but it doesn't prevent that. And we were talking about this a bit before the show, and you made a really good point about the fact that you're basically training people into a behavior and then changing the rules.
Yeah, totally conditioned people. So I feel like it conditioned a whole new generation of people into being like, hey, it's okay, there's no risks involved with taking a sexy photo and sending it to someone. And let's be real, like, sometimes these people that you're sending them to probably are not like your best mate who you know is a trustworthy person. And so it's kind of conditioned us into like, okay, we've taken away all the risks, so get into the habit of doing this. And people have been enjoying doing that, which is absolutely fine. We're not about body shaming here. I think everybody needs to love who they are. But then at some stage along the way, that protection was slowly and cleverly rolled back.
Yeah, and this was, I think it's important to note here as well, Snapchat came of age to a group of people who'd grown up with revenge pornography. So this is something horrible where you send a sexy photo or you film a video with presumably consensually, let's not even get into filming people without consent, but presumably consensually with a partner or by yourself, you've sent it to someone you trust and then the relationship's broken down, or they just think it's really funny or whatever, and they then spread it to everybody. Now, that can be to everybody at your school. Like, this has been associated with people being driven to suicide because everyone at their school saw them in some capacity. Or it can pop up on free pornography sites, you know, and will forever be attached to you if somebody knows what they're doing. And so Snapchat came out basically to safeguard yourself against this so that you could still have the fun, sexy image sharing without the risk. And I think that's what makes it kind of detestable that the format has changed, because it's moved away from its whole purpose.
Oh, the whole app is ridiculous because, like, even, you know how they had a public float? Like, this is where you'll see that Andrew's a super geek, right? So they had a public float, which means that, like, a whole bunch of people, like, bought shares in the company. And what that also means is that the company has to be really upfront and honest and tell their shareholders about what they plan to do in the future and what they're currently doing and like how much money there is in the bank, etc., etc. Right. So a couple of things came out. One, they don't have all that much money really, considering how many people use their platform. And secondly, they were like, so in the next version of Snapchat, we're going to try and like streamline the user interface and like make it, you know, just a bit easier to use and more accessible. Reading between the lines, that says to me, nobody knows how to use this stupid thing. We need to make it easy to use. So yeah, I think they have lost their way a little bit, and I feel that they've admitted that somewhat.
Yeah, I think that they're perhaps not the powerhouse they thought they were.
Is it still a safe space, though?
I think it depends. There are people who use Snapchat. There's a lot of sex workers who use Snapchat that make a killing. And basically, you know, you send me this and I add you to my thing and I send out these videos at this time. And while I know that's not a conventional safe space, it makes it safer for people to practice, to participate in sex work without actually having contact with someone who can hurt them, like physical contact, because they don't have to use their phone number. So in some respects, it's still a good platform for certain things, but it's not a good platform for what it used to be. It's not a safe space for most users.
I think that it's like, it's so interesting because you have to kind of assess it for what's going to work for you, and it's not like you can't apply just a blanket rule across things.
Just quickly before we go, I have to tell you that the primary way I've used the app is to receive pictures of my friend's dog. So for that, it's a very safe space.
I also receive photos of my friend's dog, but I feel that it's actually his boyfriend dressed up as a dog.
You're on 101.9 Coast FM, and you're in the empty closet.
With Andrew and Sam. So we've discovered that Snapchat is not the safest place that it once used to be. And Tumblr is rapidly transforming at a rate of knots into potentially not being the safest place ever for some communities. There are other apps that have been like a bit of a safe haven for people, and like I'm so surprised, the rise of like message groups in all the different messaging apps. Like, it just reminds me of like, remember back in the bad old days, like when the internet was starting, people had like what were they called? News groups? Where like they would, it would be like a public forum where people would like write articles and stuff, and, you know, cause everything was text based. There were no pictures or anything, and there was no clickbait, because you couldn't click. It was all text line, like command line. Right. So we're talking about, Sam, that wasn't really even supposed to be that funny.
Well, it was. It's okay. Continue.
So the latest thing is the group chat things, which is great. I'm in a couple of group chat apps, but the rules are changing on them as well, because the Australian government,
our illustrious leaders,
Sam, who know what's best for us, obviously, have invented some legislation that basically talks about like how, if it doesn't actually explicitly say that companies can't do end-to-end encrypted messages. Now, what end-to-end encryption is where it's like you get to see the message and then it like gets put into an envelope, not a real envelope, but like a digital envelope, sent to the other person, and then the other person has to like verify that they're the right person, and then they can open the envelope and see what's on the message, right? So no one in between can intercept it. But basically what the government's doing is like writing some laws that say that anyone who operates one of these encrypted services that's end-to-end encrypted will have to help them to intercept the letters and open them and then reseal them carefully and send them on.
Now, they're very how shall we put this, circumspect in who's going to be gaining access and what's going to be allowed.
Circumcept, really? What is that word?
They're not really, they're being very shady. I hate to accuse the government of engaging in something that may not be perfectly open and honest, but in this situation, they are not being perfectly open and honest.
It's very ambiguous the way that it's been written from what I've read. It sounds like the government can basically, like, if they identify, and that's the important thing, it's not for everyone, but it's like if they identify you as a person of interest in an investigation, then they can basically get a warrant to try and like get your chat records and stuff.
Now, my understanding is also that they haven't knocked out the idea of, for the purposes of investigation, allowing third parties access to that information. And none of this is a comfort, given that you don't have to know what you're under investigation for, or even whether there's any, thing to it.
You won't even know that you're under investigation.
No, and one of the big things that people are really worried about with this, is that we already have in this country perhaps some laws that are trying to change the rights of independent journalists and media organizations to report on the government using source, like the anonymous source has always been a thing in journalism, and whether or not you take on board what they say has always been a little bit up to journalistic integrity versus the evidence. The government's been pushing to change this for a while because that's not, a sign of creepy government overreach at all. And now they're basically, one of the big fears is that if you have an anonymous tip-off from something that the government doesn't want to talk about, not that is illegal to talk about, but just that the government doesn't want to talk about it, then they can pursue legal action against you and then forcibly find out who your sources are without telling anyone involved. So what this does, the fear of it silences free speech, as in does not allow media to report on things that are of public interest.
So I don't know whether it would... So that's not my biggest concern, because I don't know whether that would be the case. I feel like people would just like go old school and be like, hey, meet me at the cafe down at the corner and we'll have a conversation.
How do you think people contact journalists? Do you think they just rock up at like the ABC building? And do you think they're allowed to walk in the door?
Totally via homing pigeon and smoke signals.
So, yeah. But, okay, so what's your concern?
My biggest concern is there's a portion of the legislation that I can't remember exactly what it says, but more or less it says if there's, it can force companies to create extra software that can be implanted into devices that the person of interest might have. So, for an example, if I have a smart speaker at my house and I become the subject of an investigation, then the company that has the software for the smart speaker may be compelled legally to plant an extra little bit of software in there that, like, it might seem innocuous, but it might be something that, I don't know, means that the microphone's always on and the device doesn't tell you about it. Or it might be some other way of like eavesdropping, or it might just be like looking at what are all the commands that you've asked your smart speaker to do. Like, we don't know the depth of it, but like it could get pretty scary. And
the fact of the matter is, under investigation, there's people who will go, well, if you've got nothing to hide, then it won't matter. And that's rubbish, because the fact of the matter is, if you're under investigation, you don't necessarily have to have done anything wrong, because under investigation is not charges. Like, that's it really means nothing, and it gives it a backdoor into your home and your privacy, which is quite horrific. It is worth mentioning, this is the first time anywhere in the world this kind of law has been implemented.
And globally, all of the big players are kind of saying that, hey, we don't want to engineer like some backdoor into our the security on our software because we're super proud that we developed secure software.
And also, if we engineer in a backdoor, you know, it's not just people who we allow to use it who will try to get through that backdoor. So it's not just the government who's going to be able to access your information. Not that that's not horrific enough, but, you know, anybody who's sufficiently motivated and skilled can get in.
Yeah, it's all a bit of a minefield. We're probably going to revisit this in a later episode at some stage when the dust settles and we see what actually the legislation means in practice. But until then, we need to keep searching for some of those safe spaces.
Thanks for listening to The Empty Closet, brought to you by 1019 Coast FM Cairns.